Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to present our PowerPoint presentation on military technology and its significance up till 2100. And I also want to simultaneously make an argument that might sound a bit counterintuitive. However, it's that if you want to understand the last 80 years of world politics, you should not look at merely treaties or elections, but you should also look at something called weapons. My thesis is essentially that military technology isn't a passive byproduct of history, but it's a casual force. Now, each major technological leap, such as the bomb or the Cold War arsenal, and now drones, cyber weapons, and military artificial intelligence, has redefined who gets to use violence, how that violence is justified, and what the international system fears most. Now, we'll trace this argument from the nuclear age through the Cold War and into today's AI moment. So, why use technology as a lens at all? First of all, weapons reveal what states actually prioritize. Not what they say in speeches, but what they spend billions of dollars building. Second, arms races are almost a textbook example of what international relations scholars call structural realism. Now, Kenneth Waltz argued that in an anarchic system with no higher authority above the state, states arm not necessarily because they're aggressive, but because they can never be sure of another state's intentions. So therefore, they prepare for the worst case scenario. It's also known as the security dilemma. Thirdly, every new weapon forces international law to catch up. Whether it be proportionality, discrimination between combatants and civilians, all of this gets renegotiated and relabeled in different terms to update the changing international law scenario. Now, um, so the question I want you all to also sit with is, does technology drive history or does politics drive technology? That's something I would like you all to keep in mind as we move along in the presentation. Now, let's start a little bit with the Manhattan Project. Between 1942 and 1945, working with Britain and Canada, uh, uh, roughly $2 billion and 130,000 people were employed to build the atomic bomb. And this was scientifically led by Robert Oppenheimer, a historical figure I'm sure most of you would know. However, the political trigger for the reasoning essentially for why it was built in the first place and why research was upscaled so much was a 1939 letter from Einstein and his colleague warning Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might be pursuing the same technology. Now, this is the security dilemma logic as the best possible example. Because the US built the bomb largely to make sure Germany didn't get there first. The first detonation, the Trinity test, happened in New Mexico in July 1945. And historians essentially still debate the real motive between using it uh, in Hiroshima. Was it actually about ending the war with Japan, or was it also a signal to the Soviet Union? John Lewis Gaddis discusses this in his atomic diplomacy thesis directly. Now, this also then obviously brings us to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Roughly 70 to 80,000 people died immediately in Hiroshima and 40,000 in Nagasaki, and tens of thousands more died afterward from radiation and injury. This remains the only use of nuclear weapons in war, and here's where political theory essentially becomes essential. Michael Walzer's just war framework separates the justice of entering a war from the justice of how you fight it. Even granting the US was justified in fighting Japan, the bombings raised serious questions about proportionality and discriminations between combatants and civilians. And this was also explored by the International Court of Justice when it had an advisory opinion on the legality of the use of uh, nuclear weapons or nuclear technology in a war scenario, and they did not essentially come to a decision. So it still remains to be debated and still remains to be sort of proven whether you could legally deploy an atom bomb in today's world of international law. Now, the traditional live historical debate is that the traditional view says the bombs shortened the war and saved lives, and the revisionist view argues Japan was already seeking surrender terms, and the bombs were partly a demonstration to the Soviets, as I said earlier. Either way, this event created something new. right? A normative taboo against nuclear weapons, and what scholar Nina Tannenwald calls the nuclear taboo. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to October 1961. The Soviet Union detonates the Tsar Bomba, roughly 50 megatons, about 3,300 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. And it's still the most powerful device ever tested. By the 1960s, combined US and Soviet stockpiles exceeded 30,000 warheads. And now the security dilemma model explains the dynamic. Essentially, that each side builds up defensively, but that build up looks offensive to the other side, so they build up too, and then the spiral just continues from there. This is, again, realism in its cleanest form. Capability, not stated intention, drives strategic behavior in a system with no central authority. So, how exactly did this spiral not end in catastrophe? Something called deterrence theory. Bernard Brody called the bomb the absolute weapon, a weapon whose purpose becomes preventing war rather than winning it. Because the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or otherwise known as MAD, means neither side can win in exchange. Thomas Schelling took this further, arguing nuclear weapons became tools of coercive signaling rather than instruments of actual war fighting, and quote unquote the threat that leaves something to chance. And strategic stability at this nuclear level didn't eliminate conflict. It pushed it downward into proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam, what's called the stability instability paradox. Um, we can also see an example of, however, this is not always true, as we can see in cases such as the Able Archer exercise, where nuclear bombs were seriously thought of being used as retaliation. Now, let's pivot a bit. After the Cold War, warfare shifts from a competition over destructive quantity to a competition over precision and deniability. Sovereignty itself gets contested in new ways. You no longer need to cross a physical border to attack a state, and sometimes there's no visible attacker at all. The Copenhagen School's securitization theory is very useful here because Buzan and Weaver argue something becomes a security threat not just from raw capability, but because political actors successfully frame it as existential. That's exactly what happens with drones, cyber, and as we'll see, AI. The US drone program expanded massively after 9/11, with thousands of strikes across Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Audrey Kurtz Cronin analysis argues drones deliver tactical wins by killing specific individuals without strategic success, because killing individuals doesn't exactly dismantle the networks around them. And there's also a sovereignty problem because these strikes routinely happen without host state consent, straining the UN Charter's non intervention norms. And going back to Walzer's framework, which we discussed earlier, drones remove this risk to the striking party. Does eliminating your own risk lower the threshold for how seriously you weigh the decision to use force in the first place? Drone warfare might be the closest embodiment of an asymmetrical battle space, where violence flows one direction and the risk doesn't flow back. Now, in 2010, researchers also then discovered Stuxnet, a joint US Israeli operation that used malicious code to physically damage Iranian nuclear centrifuges. It's widely considered the first weapon to cause real physical damage purely through cyberspace. Cyber warfare also collapses the boundary between war and peace altogether, because attribution is often unclear, escalation thresholds are ambiguous, and non state actors can achieve effects once reserved for states. Securitization theory again explains how these threats get politically constructed as existential in order to justify new security institutions. So now across, so yeah, moving on, and that pattern is essentially playing out again right now with AI. In 2026, Anthropic clashed with the Pentagon over a roughly $200 million contract, refusing to let its Claude models be used for autonomous weapons targeting or domestic surveillance without human oversight. Now, the Pentagon responded by labeling Anthropic a supply chain risk and signing deals with seven rival tech companies instead. Tensions further escalated after the Pentagon claimed Anthropic had asked whether Claude was used in the January 2026 operation to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. And this was sort of a genuinely new kind of governance dispute, where a private AI developer tries to retain after the fact oversight over how its own model gets used in an actual lethal state operation. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the Israeli military has deployed a suite of AI assisted targeting tools such as the Lavender, the Gospel, and the Where's Daddy to generate target lists at speed and scale beyond traditional intelligence analysis. And according to investigative reporting, the scale and casualty threshold claims in that reporting remain contested, and the IDF maintains that human review of every target is required. And what's new here, which is very different from the nuclear era, is where scarcity uh, plays its role. It's no longer considered fissile material controlled by states. Its model access and oversight controlled by a handful of private companies is arguably the biggest structural break in the pattern we face today. And it's the open question this presentation leaves you with. When the actor with the most leverage over how the newest military technology gets used isn't a government at all, what does that do to everything we just said about sovereignty, deterrence, and the laws of war? So, with that, I would like to thank you all for listening to my part of the presentation. I'll be now handing this over to Sane, who will continue.
So we've discussed through the nuclear age and where AI-assisted warfare stands today. The harder question arises regarding where this actually goes. Nobody can predict 74 years of history with absolute confidence, just like how nobody predicted the internet from the Manhattan Project. But we could in fact undergo something more useful, which is to look into how the last transformative military technology reshaped global politics, and use that as a lens for various plausible paths forward. Where today, we'd like to focus on three particular scenarios, and show that history suggests about which one might be the most likely and the significance of such. The first scenario is stabilization, and this is the optimistic case. After Tsar Bomba and the peak of the arms race in the early 1960s, the world did not keep escalating forever. Instead, we got the Partial Test Treaty ban in 1963, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, arms control agreements like SALT and START, and mutually assured destruction became something almost stabilizing, meaning it continued to be terrifying but also predictable. The stabilization scenario for AI is that something similar happens with autonomous weapons and AI capabilities, where major powers, including the likes of the US, China, and the EU, would eventually agree that unrestricted AI arms racing is too dangerous for everyone, including the winner. Hence, we may get something like a compute non-proliferation regime, which are the ones that have access to the physical hardwares and manufacturing capabilities of chips, like TSMC and NVIDIA. Those are the ones that put export controls on advanced chips, and there may also be verification regimes, just like how the IAEA inspects nuclear facilities for uranium limits, or maybe formal treaties banning fully autonomous lethal decision making, similar to how we've never lifted the taboo on chemical weapons. Therefore, under the stabilization scenario, it does not necessarily mean the world becomes safe completely, but rather it means the world reaches an uneasy equilibrium, just like the way it did with nuclear weapons, where everyone still has the capabilities, but nobody really uses it, because the cost of using it destroys the users too. The second scenario we'd like to consider is the escalation case. Instead of treaties formed through the United Nations or directed by major powers, we may get a rerun of the Cold War dynamics, but much faster and with more players in the dynamic. Where the US and China treats AI capabilities the way the US and USSR treated warhead counts, it could be a race where falling behind is treated as existential. Except this race moves faster than the nuclear one ever did, as nuclear weapons took years to build and test, while AI models can be trained, upgraded, and deployed in months. In this scenario, arms control talks stall the way nuclear disarmament talks have repeatedly stalled since the 1990s. Autonomous weapons proliferate to smaller and smaller state actors, meaning AI powers and technology will eventually reach to smaller state actors. Hence, even if the US, China, and the EU eventually agree to some autonomous weapons framework amongst themselves, that doesn't stop smaller states in abusing such power in its military. Therefore, we don't get a two power Cold War, but instead, we would get a multipolar arms race, which would be much harder to manage than the bipolar one because there's no single other side to negotiate with. This is the scenario where military AI keeps behaving like precision guided munitions did after the Gulf War, where each side assumes a temporary technical edge, and that assumption keeps everyone racing rather than talking. The third and final scenario we'd like to consider, and maybe the hardest to plan for, is the disruption scenario. In 1945, the political order did not shift gradually, but rather it shifted in a single moment, where once the Hiroshima bombing occurred, within days the calculus of every government on Earth changed. where empires that had planned around conventional army balance of power politics for centuries suddenly had to reckon with a technology that made geography, army size, and even alliances secondary to a handful of scientists and a supply chain. The disruption scenario argues something similar could happen with AI, where there isn't going to be incremental but gradual capability growth, but rather a sudden, discontinuous jump. Therefore, if a single actor achieves a decisive AI advantage, something approaching general purpose superhuman capabilities in strategically relevant domains, something like an AI system substantially exceeding human capabilities in domains that matters for state power, which includes the likes of cyber operations, weapons design, strategic planning, intelligence analysis, or scientific research with military applications, then the shift in global power could be as fast and as total as it was in August 1945. This is the scenario where military planners and AI researchers actually worried the most about. Not because it's most likely, but it's because it's the least reversible. Stabilization and escalation are both processes you can still influence mid course, but disruption, almost by definition, is the one where the decisions get made before most of the world even knows that they're being made. Now that we've considered the different scenarios that may occur in the near future, particularly towards the end of the century, we like to discuss which of such scenario will be the most likely based on historical patterns. Major military technology today follows the same pattern, where they initially destabilize, then institutionalize, then normalize, and looking at nuclear weapons, they destabilize the post-war order in an instant, then force the creation of an entirely new institution, including the UN Security Council structure and the IAEA. Precision warfares have also destabilized the political cost calculus of intervention in the late 90s, and then they were normalized into a new baseline expectations and how wars were fought. This is no exclusion for cyber and drone warfares too, where they destabilize boundaries between war and peace, and now we continue to stay in the process of institutionalizing rules around such currently. Therefore, the pattern was never that the technology arrives first, then the world panics, and the world remains silent. But rather, it has always been that when new technology arrives, the world panics, and we humans eventually, sometimes after a crisis, sometimes after a near miss, have the institutions catch up. The Cuban Missile Crisis depicts this clearly, where the tension and near catastrophe was the reason why such test ban treaties and decades of arms control momentum were actually produced. Therefore, the open question for AI is rather simple. Will we get the institutions before or after the near miss? With nuclear weapons, we got most of our safety infrastructure after Hiroshima and after Cuba, reactively. And the stakes of reacting after an AI driven crisis may be much higher because, unlike a missile, like AI capabilities advantage can't be arms controlled back out of existence once it exists. So, in conclusion, military technology isn't a footnote to political history, but it's often the first draft of it. The Tsar Bomba wasn't really a weapon anyone intended to use, but it was a message about power tested in the sky over Russia, and everyone in the world understood exactly what it meant. AI development today is sending a similar message, in slow motion, such through chip export controls, through national AI strategies, through defense budgets, and quietly redirecting towards autonomous systems. The few scenarios we've laid out, including stabilization, escalation, disruption, aren't predictions, but they are a framework for watching the next 20, 30, 50 years with the right questions in mind. Every treaty signed, every research lab that goes dark, every autonomous system deployed in an active conflict is a data point about which path we're actually on. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And if the 20th century taught us anything, it's that the technology we build to win the next war are usually the ones that end up rewriting the rules of peace. Thank you.